grateful for everyone that's here, for your participation and their testimony, and for all for the members is here as well. Mark, would you call the roll, please?
Representative Campbell.
Excused.
Representative Knapp.
Here.
Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Lawley.
Here.
Representative Riggins.
Excused.
Representative Schmidt.
Here.
Representative Tarver.
Here.
Representative Weber.
She was here, and there they come. Try again, Mark.
Chairman Heiner.
Here.
Thank you.
Would you, do you want to call those that missed it there?
Chairman Representative Campbell.
Here.
And Representative Weber.
Present.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So today, we're going to let the vice chair chair the meeting. I'm going to participate with his first bill, and so he's going to take over chairmanship. So hand the gavel over. Vice Chair Tarver, it's all yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Committee, before us, we have House Bill 137. Mr. Chairman, would you like to present it?
You notice how this is lower down here than up there? Mr. Chairman, or Vice Chair.
Please.
Thank you. My name is Scott Heiner. I'm representative from House District 18, southwest part of the state. I have before you here is House Bill 137. It's the reviser's bill. So we as a citizen legislature, we're going to go home in about 5 weeks, but that doesn't mean that the work has ended. At that point, the LSO continues on preparing these bills that and statutes for publication. But once we have gavelled out, sometimes they find, well, almost always they find some errors. Sometimes they leave out a period or a semicolon, misspell a word. And so every year we have what's called a reviser's bill to be able to fix some of those errors and be able to go back in the statute book and fix those errors, because some of these statutes will be there for decades, if not longer. So that's what we have here, to fix some of those things that need to be remedied. So I'll take you through the bill quickly. On page 2, this is the Wyoming Governmental Claims Act, Title I, Chapter 39, and they referenced Articles 101 through 120, but there was actually 123. The articles go through 123, so it's just changing that one. And then pages 3 through 14 is just adding public in front of the school foundation program account. Just clarification, that's a public school foundation program account, and that was left out in the original bills. So for those 11 pages, it's going through the different statutes and adding public to the school foundation program account. And then on page 14 of the bill, it's striking the word program. Here it's not referencing the public school foundation account, it's just referencing the foundation account. So they're wanting to strike out program. Page 15, again, is public school foundation program account. 16, same, and that goes on for a couple of pages. Page 20, here the title is the Public Health and Safety Act, and Chapter 21, Domestic Violence Protection. There's actually Articles 101 through 112, and so that's to fix that problem. It only referenced 111. And then in the bottom of that page, is in the original bill, it said providing the officer acts in good faith, and it would be more appropriate to strike that out and say provided that the officer acts in good faith. So you can see they go through this with a thorough analysis after we're all gone. And on page 22, this is pretty typical. Under paragraph, they forgot a space there, so it's adding a space. And then on the last page, again, adding public in front of school foundation program account. So with that, Mr. Vice Chair, I stand for any questions.
Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Vice Chair, if I may, one more comment, you might, if I may, one more comment.
Yes, please.
Members of the committee, you might ask why this is coming to the Minerals Committee. The reason is, as the majority floor leader, I want to get this bill out quickly and so that we can address it on the floor and have it out of the way while we'll deal with other matters. So I felt like we could quickly review this and get it to the floor, and so we can dispense with this necessary bill. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there any representatives or senators that would like to testify? Is there any agencies that would like to testify? Are there any citizens that would like to testify? Is there anyone else in here that would like to testify on this bill? Okay, I will close testimony, public comment, and committee, what's your pleasure? All right, we've been moved. Any comment? Is this our little question being called? Roll call vote. That was a hard one for you. Scott, you should have given that one to me.
I may look dumb, but I'm not dumb. All the time.
We're voting on House Bill 137. Representative Campbell,
Aye.
Representative Knapp,
Aye.
Representative Larson,
Aye.
Representative Lawley,
Aye.
Representative Riggins,
Excuse.
Representative Schmidt,
Aye.
Representative Tarver,
Aye.
Representative Weber,
Aye.
Chairman Heiner. Aye. 8 aye, 1 excused.
Thank you.
Pass.
Okay, committee, our next bill is House Bill 16, and I believe our presenter is preparing currently. Mr. Larson, Representative Larson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman. My name's Lloyd Larson. I serve with you in the legislature from House District 54. I've, in conversation with the good chairman, I offered and he's allowed me to present this bill. This is an interim bill that came to the committee during your interim topic regarding our nuclear statutes. And as a preface, I just want to validate, I've tried to get you all some information ahead of time. You should have received a couple of publications from the NRC on spent fuel transportation, spent fuel storage. If you didn't get those, let me know. There's another on background of dry cask storage. We have a letter of support from Miss Ronnie Franovich, who's been a consultant to an advanced nuclear reactor manufacturer. Ms. Franovich had planned on joining with us remotely today. I probably failed to adequately inform her how to get on ahead of time, and so she won't be joining us, but her letter is here. And then we also had an additional letter of support from folks that you'll hear from Radiant. I also have provided to you two amendments that I think, if you consider working the bill, would fit well into the bill. And as we go through the bill, I'll share with you, Mr. Vice Chairman, how those would fit and why will do that. They're numbered 5402 and 5401. 5402 really applies to this bill as we go through it. 5401 will come at the end and as it applies to advanced nuclear reactor manufacturers. Then to further explain a little bit on why I've been engaged in this conversation, goes back, Mr. Vice Chairman, to a few years ago when the Natrium project was announced and that it was going to be located in Wyoming, and they were looking at sites to pick. The former chairman, Representative Burkhart, myself, and former Representative Mike Greer from Worland and Holly Kruka from the School of Energy Resources were invited to attend a meeting at the Idaho National Lab. When we got there, we were met by very cordially by the folks there at Idaho National Lab, and I remember the first thing they told us when they got to sit down is they said, "We don't think you understand what getting this nuclear reactor means." And they were right. We didn't have really a concept of the doors or the possibilities that it could open up to Wyoming on not only have nuclear generation, but all the businesses that are associated with the nuclear industry. We came back, started working with the governor's office in trying to say, how do we make sure that we capture all of the possibilities for Wyoming? And that's just, all of the other businesses that participate in this supply chain. We had some people at the Business Council and the Energy Authority started just doing cold calls to the folks in the nuclear industry in the Ohio Valley and saying, "Hey, you ever considered Wyoming?" And at first they kind of patted us on the head and said, "Thank you for the call. We're fine." But about 3 years later, they've all expressed a very serious interest in potentially doing things in Wyoming. And part of that has allowed us to do that is our regulatory framework and our statutory framework. We have currently in place three sections of in our environmental quality section for nuclear issues. The first one that we will be referring to today is in 3511 Article 15 is radioactive waste. It was our first one that we put into place. That currently allows for, through a process, the storage of radioactive nuclear waste, which includes spent fuel here in Wyoming, currently, now, okay? We went on to, later we amended our statutes, and we worked when I first came in for about 3-4 years to become an agreement state with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and so that's Article 20, which has been very beneficial as Natrium and other people look at us to get away from as much as that federal burden because the state is more nimble and able to help. It's been very beneficial for our uranium producers in the state to do that. The third thing we've done, and this really goes back to a colleague of mine from Fremont County, Dave Miller, whose whole life was in the nuclear industry, mining. He brought into statute the advanced nuclear reactors as they were just being contemplated, laying the framework in the event that we had wanted to consider having advanced nuclear reactors as they were being developed. And we, then once the Natrium project was announced, we amended our nuclear waste statutes to allow Natrium to store their spent fuel on site because spent fuel is still currently in Article 15, the nuclear waste stuff. So as we see this industry evolve, it's become necessary then for us to address changes in statute that's warranted. And this bill takes spent fuel out of the nuclear waste statute and creates its own, because it's not waste. It's really the simplest reason for doing that. Waste is, my wife has every spare drawer in our house is filled with fabric, but when she starts using fabric, she sews with it. What she can't use in making whatever it is, that becomes quilt blocks or comes to my shop for a rag, right? But at some point, there's a component of that that's just garbage. Boyd chucks it when he's cleaning his hands off. That's waste, can't be used again. And when we talk about nuclear waste, those would be the end-use products resulting from, if we look at a fire alarm that has a component in there that has a nuclear component, once it's done, can't be used again. If you were refurbishing something from a nuclear reactor, say a valve that was being replaced or a line that you're never going to use again, that's waste, can't be used again. Spent fuel can. That's evolved over the time, and so we're trying to put that in the framework statutorily that it allows us to look at that as in storage as a differently than waste. So what we do, if I may, Mr. Vice Chairman, move through the bill a little bit, is we create a whole new section. We are creating Article 22, the used nuclear fuel storage statute. We start out with definitions, talking about what a consolidated interim storage facility looks like. And the key word there is interim, meaning temporary, because the federal requirements are that the federal government has been required to provide a permanent storage for nuclear spent fuel. Yucca Mountain started, that's been aborted, nothing, that did not go through. Currently, federal regulation says that you cannot have a temporary storage site for spent fuel until there's a permanent site. It kind of appears to me that they got that backwards. And I don't know that I fully understand why at the time when they created the federal regulations, they've done that. There's the effort currently in Congress that says, no, until we get a permanent site, where can the temporary site be? So these statutes, we're basing that on the ability of the NRC then to say you could have a temporary storage facility for spent fuel in Wyoming. The reason that that's important is because as the nuclear generating sites that have been in place for 50 years or however long it's been, that are now starting to be retired, have been required, because we didn't have a permanent site, to store the spent fuel on site. As those are retired and they reclaim those sites, for example, I think it's Diablo Canyon, it's one of those sites in Southern California, was built on property that was owned by the U.S. Marine Corps. And they've retired that. The Marine Corps would like to use that property, but can't, because it's hosting and storing the spent fuel from the generation cycle of that plant. Having the ability, and can't move them because of that federal requirement right now. So that is the case across the country. I note California, but it's the case across the country where we've had these nuclear generation sites. And as we decommission those as they're retired, what can we do with that spent fuel and for how long? until we get a permanent site in place. So this piece of legislation contemplates that and realizes that currently there's not an interim storage a requirement. There's not, the NRC is not allowed to put an interim storage piece in place until Congress changes that. But that in anticipation of that, as that seems to be in the works now, this would have everything in place should that all change. So we identify in the definitions what a storage facility is, and we require it to be put in dry cask storage containers. The questions that I've received as I talked to some of you are on the viability and the safety of these dry cask storage containers. We'll have more of that conversation as we get through there. Very safe, have proven to be very, very safe over the time frame that they've been used without leaking. And then it talks about independent used fuel storage installation. Independent means is that is coming from a place where that fuel has been spent, where the energy was used to generate another electricity and then brought to an independent place to be stored. The ownership of that fuel never goes away from the utility that used it. If Lloyd used it at his power plant and it ends up going to Representative Schmid's storage facility, I still own it, still have the responsibility for it. The installation is the facility. Then it talks about what used nuclear fuel is. Starting on the bottom of page 3, it brings in the requirements of the Department of Environmental Quality to review the application that an installation, a person wanting to have an installation wants to have. They are required to comply with all the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's requirements and regulations in order to meet qualifications to be stored. That has to happen first. On page 5, you'll see particularly over there on C, that lines 11 through 15, that then the director, sitting back here, would would approve the application of the installation and move forward. In talking to the director, based on your last meeting, Mr. Vice Chairman, where you guys considered this bill, he had some reservation about the language on C where it says, through the director shall approve the application for an installation. Working with him here, if you have your 5402 amendment, the amendment that we would recommend you consider if you work the bill is after that you would remove the approve and change that to say shall review the application with some new language there to insert if the application is complete and technically adequate, then the director shall issue a permit for the installation. That brings that process more into line with what the agency does on other permitting processes where they review it, make sure everything's complies with the federal regulations and meeting the state regulations. On page 6, you'll note, because there's questions on how long is temporary, and they have to validate on an interim site that it is temporary. Visiting with the director again, we looked at this and it talks about having substantial assurances, but it really doesn't define what substantial assurances are, but then it comes down in this initial language to talk about that it's time limited from the NRC, that it has a time frame for the movement and the delivery to a reprocessing plant or a repository. We amend that language again. If you look at your amendment, starting on line 9, we say that is temporary. The department shall receive substantial assurance from the applicant that the installation is temporary. For the purposes of this paragraph, substantial assurances shall include a license that is time limited from the NRC, a binding time frame for the movement of the used nuclear fuel, or for a binding commitment for delivery of the used nuclear fuel for reprocessing, or to a purchaser of the used fuel for reprocessing. So that cleans that language up as a little ambiguous. We put, you all put, we didn't put, you all put in there, starting on line 16, some requirements of the applicant to help the locals understand the impacts of such an installation on the community. We would just suggest on line 20, where it talks about the number of jobs to be created, that we insert the estimated number of jobs. I don't know how we define specifically how many they would be. The local and state taxes, all the benefits. An important part in F is to make sure that public entities, the communities around there, have publicly available reports or notifications and violations from the NRC to this facility, to keep them appraised of any communication between the NRC and that entity, the installation. In G, we also say that upon receipt of an application under the article, the director will apply for any funds available to the state from the federal interim storage fund. The interim storage fund is a fund that, I believe if I have this correctly, there is a tax on utilities that use nuclear storage for the storage of those for the long-term storage, and they also have that available for interim storage. I think that there's around $30 billion in there to date that can be used to help offset the impacts on the state that stores any spent nuclear fuel. We changed that. The director thought that gave him a little too much power in applying for that, and so we would change that to say the director shall, as soon as possible and upon approval of the governor, apply for such information. Then down at the bottom, we note that this, again in the bill, as I noted earlier, that this fuel belongs to the owner, which is the person that generated it, or until it's transferred to, the ownership is transferred to the United States or federal agency. We would suggest, the director for the agency, in looking at this, thought that we could further help the installation and the owner of the fuel understand that it's temporary, and we would recommend new language at the bottom that said, if the owner of this used nuclear fuel stored under this article has not transferred the fuel to another location, or if the United States or federal agency has not taken title to the owner, to the fuel, the owner shall be assessed additional fees established by rule of the Environmental Quality Council, provided that the fees shall be in amounts sufficient to encourage the removal of the spent fuel. Trying to incentivize them getting rid of it. Committee, Mr. Vice Chairman, Chairman, Committee, as you go through the end of Section 1, which ends on page 9, that's all that's what Article 22 does. And then we go back in Section 2, we go back into first, the very beginning of the Environmental Quality Act, which is 3511-103, and we add this new article, make sure that they understand that's included. Then we go into Article 11, which is the radioactive waste, and we remove all the references to spent fuel and insert language on high-level radioactive waste, and that definition is right at the beginning of Article 15 and 1501. At the end, and that's kind of what you work yourself through. Mr. Chairman, if you come over to page 15 on Section 3, you're going to see a repealer. That is in Article 15, the nuclear waste, and we remove the definition of spent fuel out of nuclear waste because we've now put it in the new Article 22. With that, Mr. Chairman, if I may, before we go to questions, I would like to take you to the other amendment, which is 5401. And this is in response to, we have 22 put into place, but it contemplates bringing fuel in from other places across the country that had generated that spent nuclear fuel. We have had interest, and you'll hear comments from some of those today, of being able to manufacture advanced nuclear reactors in the state. In that process, particularly on microreactors that would maybe be a megawatt to 1.5 megawatts in capacity, those would be manufactured and fueled in the state, then deployed. Boom. It's like you're renting a piece of equipment out in the oil field on location. And it would be there, if that's an Alaskan village or wherever. When the time comes that needs to be refueled, another modular or portable reactor would go out, be inserted. The one that had the spent fuel comes back to be refurbished and refueled. That spent fuel that originated there, they need to have the capacity to store that spent fuel, which is much smaller quantity, but they still need to have the capacity to store that on site. So in anticipation of that and trying to respond, and the reason we're trying to respond is as one of these manufacturers who are here have been considering, I went to a public comment session that they had in Casper, and one of the questions came back to these folks, Radiant, and the question to them was, what can we do as a community or in the state to help move this process along of having a manufacturing facility that you're proposing? And the response was, however, currently in statute, it doesn't prohibit us from storing that on site. It's always helpful to have clear statutory language that allows us to do that. So I've crafted this amendment to try to bring that in place. And what we do is, if you look at 5401, is we add to the definition, advanced nuclear reactor manufacturer means a person that's physically located, person means an entity, located in Wyoming that manufactures and deploys advanced nuclear reactors at and from the manufacturer location in Wyoming, and that refurbishes and refuels those reactors at the Wyoming manufacturing location. And so then we go down there and insert where we've got independent storage facilities. We insert the ability on page 8 and 16 to the owner or advanced nuclear reactor manufacturer. And on the second page, you'll see that we on page 11, I want to get to that, after line 2. This is going back into the nuclear waste statutes. It says, a facility where advanced nuclear reactor manufacturers as defined stores other highly radioactive materials as Nuclear Regulatory Commission determines permanent location. And then we go to, and what this does will allow, as you refurbish that reactor on site of manufacturing, again, you may have some part of the refurbishing, some parts that are radioactive that are waste and need to be stored on site. And then we have on page 14, we put there on line 15 after state, a facility that is operated in the state and a facility where advanced nuclear reactor manufacturers defined in 2201AI stores other highly radioactive materials that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission determines requires permanent isolation. Oh, I'm sorry, I read the wrong one. Or retrieved or accepted by an advanced nuclear reactor manufacturer as defined for storage on site of the manufacturer. That's the spent fuel. With that long explanation of the bill, Mr. Vice Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Committee, do we have any questions? Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Representative Larson, just trying to kind of capture what I think happened through many of the amendments perhaps and moving around of things. This bill now will not allow someone that's outside of the state of Wyoming to just bring nuclear, whether we call it waste or spent fuel, here to Wyoming.
Mr. Vice Chairman, Representative Lawley, and forgive me, please, but it's really important that we understand waste and spent fuel. And so currently, the waste, that holds in Article 15 doesn't change.
Okay.
Okay, boom. And the requirements still remain the same for spent fuel as if it were still in 15. We just identify it not being waste. So it has to go through. You can't just one day decide, hey, I'm going over here to Representatives Weber's site and pick up her spent fuel and bring it and stick it in the gas hills. There is a long process to even allow that to happen on a temporary basis.
Ola?
As you may be aware, we've had a lot of input from folks that are concerned about this, and I think even the bill addresses that to some degree about the need for education of the public. How would you, based on the changes in this bill that the amendments suggest, how would you respond to someone who says, look, I don't want to, why should Wyoming be a place where we store this? Why, what is that? They're concerned about risks, they're concerned about everything they don't understand, and so about it, and what they do feel is a fear. So how would you respond to that?
Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Representative Lawley, I think we've walked through that exercise, I think probably most recently than any other state as we went through bringing the Natrium project to Kimmer, where we've seen a lot of the same fears. And I would also suggest, in my mind, that in society, there are various populations that have concerns on a variety of different things. And in the energy sector, in nuclear, it's a concern over leakage, radiation, what are the environmental impacts and safety impacts that we're going to have. On coal, it's environmental, safety, and impacts to the environment. Oil and gas, it's safety, impacts to the environment. They're the same, just in different degrees. And I think that the assurance that I would give them is the history in the United States on the storage of nuclear fuel or spent fuel, and the safety on the nuclear industry as a whole. On any of these energy producing, on any of these sources of energy that we have, I think it's our responsibility to help resolve those concerns. And I think that as you review the safety of transportation, the safety of storage that's in place with the NRC, I think, and I get it. I get it, but there has to be some proof. If we had accidents and derailments where gas had broke open, and but I think the evidence is just the opposite, that we have not had issues. We have, we just imposed a higher fee on transportation for nuclear waste that's transported through, and nuclear fuels that are transported through Wyoming. It's been happening on the I-80 corridor for decades and without incident. So I think we have an obligation to continue to educate, and I really think the only way I ever got past the idea that the boogeyman lived in the attic next to my bed was just the education that came over time, that realized that my fears were not valid, but my fears were real to me, and we have to continue to address those.
Follow up? Do we have any other questions? Yes, Representative Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Thank you for being here, Representative. My concern is not so much with safety, it is with chain of command. It's taking custody of this. The way that I understand this, you stressed to me several times that this is an interim stop until it finds a permanent position. But the way that I understand it, when you explained with Diablo Canyon and decommissioned sites, is that currently the federal government does not have a defined system to address this. And you told me that you are being preemptive in anticipation of what the feds are gonna do. I don't use that word preemptive, I use the word assumptive. I think we're putting the cart in front of the horse, because what I want to see is a clearly defined chain of custody. And right now, I see that there is a question in that. How, when they did their EIS, how was this waste to be accounted for according to the EIS when they built these facilities? Thank you.
Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman and Representative Campbell. Again, the chain of command is very clear. But what's the storage, and the storage plan has been identified, but there's a hiccup in the plan which has caused a backlog. And if you'll allow me, I'll help understand that. But the chain of command is who owns it and who's responsible for it, right? The owner owns it and they're responsible for it. But when this whole nuclear generation process began, the federal government was placed with the responsibility to find, design, and build a permanent repository for spent fuel. Okay? That Yucca Mountain again was the place, Magic, and that fell through. We don't have that permanent site. And because we didn't have a permanent site, and because the federal regulations from Congress when it was first designed said, you can't temporarily store those any place until you have a permanent site. Well, we don't. That's the hiccup. So the backstop to that, to loosely use your term, chain of command, is the NRC then come back and said, those who generate it now, because we don't have a place to go to and we can't store it in a temporary site, will be required to store it on site, the site where the generation takes place. So hence, we have the place in California that we referred to that has that spent fuel stored there, even though the generating facility has been decommissioned. So what we're preemptive, or however, we're putting into place in statute that how we handle spent fuel is clearly defined. Now, when and how we're allowed to do that through the NRC, that change that says you can do it, that it's allowed before there's a permanent repository, that'll be the question. That'll be the question. But having this in place, I don't know that that interferes with, I think that's just getting in ready for that to happen. I feel strongly that will, but that doesn't mean it will, right? It's just Lloyd's opinion.
Follow up?
Yeah, maybe chain of command was not the words that I should have used. I should have used chain of custody. Because in the oil and gas industry, if you go to dispose of a simple mud sample, you have to define where it came from. You have to follow it all the way to the end to where it was disposed and get a receipt on that. I see that there is a gap in the chain of custody. The other question that I wanted to ask you is, you say that we're going to have this in a specific time frame, but I did not hear any numbers in regard to that time frame. How, not having a permanent repository, how long will we have this? What is that time frame? I understand that the people who produced it are taking full possession of it. My question is, if we get this, it says we're going to have it as an interim for a time frame, but there is no number to that time frame. And I see this as a break in a chain of custody, because what is to stop them? The only penalty that I see is financial. So what is to stop these guys from leaving this with us as a permanent facility with no established timeline and no established chain of custody? Thank you.
Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman and Representative Campbell. Good question on how long. The how long part is determined by the NRC when they give them the permit to create an interim storage, that it could be held at that storage for the length that the NRC permits it for. So that comes into place on the temporary. That's why we put in that new language, that if you come to, if that time frame expires, that then you can assess the fees that will incentivize that it gets moved. The chain of custody doesn't change. Wherever it sits, there's a clear line that defines who owns it, and their responsibility. They're still responsible for it, even at the storage site, and to comply with those storage requirements. So that chain of custody is really quite clear.
Follow up?
I understand who owns it. I'm very well aware who owns it. It's the time frame. There is no set time frame. You know, when you started this conversation, you said that this bill was being preemptive. That means in anticipation of what is to come. I am not really big on being preemptive on things that haven't been brought into existence. And my biggest concern is, so we're going to trust the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to set an undetermined time frame, which is not real comforting for me. I would like to have set numbers. And not having a clear chain of custody, and with this being a preemptive bill, those are my biggest concerns. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of wide open things here for.
Representative Larson.
Thank you. And Representative Campbell, you're right. And so that's why in the process, when we look at that, look at the timeframe, doesn't mean we have to allow the installation to be built. That's why we want to have this in place. And so then when we see kind of what those timeframes are, if we don't think that's appropriate, great, then don't permit it.
Representative Smith, would you like to ask a question? You had your hand raised there a little bit ago.
Representative Campbell
Nailed
asked
it.
the question, but
Okay. Mr. Knapp, Representative Knapp.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So many questions, and I think that part of this is because although this says it came out as an interim bill, we really didn't discuss this during interim. This came as a last-minute bill in front of us, and here we sit in a committee meeting that probably should last for days with questions to get this through. But some of the questions that I have, I'll just go through the list that I see. When we talk about nuclear waste, we talk in terms of these vague terminologies. Even though nuclear waste is real, you today described it as a boogeyman. We use words like temporary storage. What does temporary storage mean to you?
Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, a defined timeframe.
Representative Knapp.
Can you further define that time frame?
Representative Larson.
If I may, I'm not sure that I'm somehow missing a point on the question, Mr. Chairman, Representative Knapp. So can you, are you asking if the state should define the time frame, or where is the time frame? Help me, I'm uncertain what you're asking.
I think I'm sorry, Mr. Vice Chair. I think with your question, you're somewhat answering the questions because the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, determined by Congress, said that there will be one storage site in the U.S. for nuclear waste. Didn't materialize partially because that storage site, the state demanded that it wasn't to be in that state. So now we talk about this in terms of temporary on-site storage. Do you believe that temporary will ever be temporary, or will that be a long-term storage on Wyoming soil in dry cast?
Representative Larson.
I believe that if we say that it has to be temporary, it has to be temporary. And so we as a state, if we're saying in our statutory framework that it has to be temporary, and that's going to be based on the time that the NRC permits it for, and we think that that temporary is in excess of what we think is appropriate, then we don't permit the installation. So is that, Mr. Chairman, so is that 25 years or 50 years? I think the number that I hear out there most is 40 years.
Representative Knapp.
Follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. In the news lately has been the lawsuit between Texas and the NRC. Are you aware of that lawsuit, and can you describe for us what that is?
Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, probably not as, he's tied up here, Mr.
Keep on rolling. We'll listen.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Knapp, so probably not as familiar as I'd like to be, but my understanding is that the NRC come in and permitted a temporary storage site without the consultation of the state of Texas. Texas has taken that to court.
Any further, Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Chairman Larson, thank you for being here. As I looking over your proposed amendment 5401, you reference other highly radioactive materials, and you also reference that some of this will be stored on the site of the manufacturer. But you also, during your testimony, talked about bringing in this used nuclear fuel from other locations within the country and maybe putting them in a temporary storage facility in the Gas Hills or somewhere within the state. So I just want for clarification here, are we contemplating one large temporary storage facility for all of this waste that's throughout the country, and then another used fuel storage in, say, Casper, wherever this manufacturing facility is? So we'd actually have two or multiple sites here in Wyoming?
Representative Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I apologize that I didn't make this clear. So on an advanced nuclear reactor manufacturer, let's just say in Casper, when they refurbish, when they deploy, when they manufacture, then they deploy, get it back for refurbishing and refueling, there will be two components that need to be stored on site that are radioactive. One would be components of the refurbishing part, valves, lines, that waste. And the other part would be the spent fuel. So that part of that amendment applies solely to an advanced nuclear reactor manufacturer and the storage of their components generated on site. The other part that you asked, we say Gas Hills, wherever, downtown Cheyenne, wherever that would be, would be open as an independent operator to take upon the capacity of that facility spent fuel from across the country. I don't think, I forget the total number of tons of spent fuel that's out there, but it's more than we could take on ourselves. It's going to require several sites across the U.S. to handle that.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So we've heard Rocky Mountain Power is contemplating additional 4 or 5 nuclear reactors here in Wyoming. So besides these used nuclear fuel storage sites, temporary used nuclear fuel storage sites, we could have 6, 8, maybe even more sites throughout the state where nuclear fuel is stored. So with these casks, they try to limit the risk, but nothing is 100% risk-free. We know that. And looking back in history, there's been 4 incidences where these casks have leaked since 2001. 4 of them in California. One of them had started leaking 6 years after it was loaded. Another one started leaking 8 years after loading. Another cask started leaking 13 years after it was loaded. The leak was detected 14 years after loading. And then in Washington State, they found that 63 of 177 tanks were leaking, and they leaked over, they're still cleaning that up, multi-billion-dollar environmental cleanup that'll take decades. So even though there's a lot of safety precautions in place, we can't guarantee 100% risk-free. So what precautions can be taken that are not already being taken with these casks if we bring them into the state of Wyoming, that we don't have leakage and environmental cleanup that could go on for decades?
Representative Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Heiner. I don't argue the information that you have, just going back to the NRC information they have, that over the 30 years that it's been used, dry cast has been used, there's been no radiation that affected the public or contaminated the environment. So that would suggest to me that if there has been leakage, that it was detected and contained fairly quick and has been very minimal. I don't know the details of the leakage that you're talking about. And just based on the information that I handed out here, would imply that. I think that your question is a valid one. Are there additional measures that we could take to ensure that safety? The dry cask storage has a and we can take it now. It's in our statutes that we can take it now. So we're just creating a new statutory environment to help us further define that. I think as technology evolves, maybe there would be some additional safety precautions, if you will, or construction requirements put into place, but I'm not aware of any additional ones that aren't being used that should be implemented.
Representative Smith. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Larson, would you accept one of these generation facilities that creates these portable reactors? Or would you accept that in your community, one of those generation facilities in your community, and/or would you support a long-term, temporary nuclear spent fuel site near your community where you live? And how would your townsfolk accept something like that?
Representative Larson.
Mr. Vice Chairman, Representative Smith, the first answer to the two is yes, I would. And I base that on the visits I've had to the Idaho National Lab, where I've looked at storage of casks and seen the construction and the site, and I feel very comfortable with it on all accounts.
Follow up?
How do you think your community would accept that?
That's
Representative
interesting, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Vice Chairman, that you asked that. So several years ago, in an election cycle, when we had a couple of issues that we had talked about in legislature on public lands, and at that same time, we had amended our nuclear statutes to accommodate advanced nuclear reactors. And people in my community, which is a fairly environmentally concerned community, is that diplomatic enough? And just were, Larson, don't you dare. You know, if you think you're going to put this nuclear stuff rat hold here, just forget it. Interestingly enough, this last summer, as I was knocked on doors, I was surprised at the number of people that says, you know, I've really had a change of heart on this nuclear stuff. And if we really want to be, in their words, carbon-free, nuclear is the way to do it. And if we're going to do that, we have to accept that we need someplace to put the spent fuel. And their attitudes had changed significantly. During that campaign cycle, I didn't have any of the constituents that brought it up that were opposed to it. In fairness to your questions, since this bill's come forward in consideration, I have had but less than 5 constituents get hold of me and say, we don't like that.
Representative Larson, I have a couple questions for you.
Please.
Knowing how efficient the federal government is, when did they start working on a permanent storage facility? And the follow-up to that question is, where are they in that process?
I think they started the process when I was still in high school.
30s?
Seriously.
30s, 40s?
20s. When I was in high school. And I think that I recall the conversation on Yucca Mountain, how finally we've got a place that we think geologically is sustainable, because they had looked at other facilities around. and then that was a long fought-out battle over, I don't know how many, but decade before that was finally shut down. And I think the NRC, and then I think that it just kind of went silent as there was capacity to store on site. But as that capacity is waning, this whole conversation has come back that we've got to find a permanent site. And, you know, as in Europe, they've been doing this for a long time. And we need to rethink now, because we put this off, on how we can do some temporary storage.
Representative Larson, so was there an answer to where we were at in that process as far as the time frame goes, or could it take 100 years or maybe 1,000, or is there any idea at all?
I think 1,000 was the number. I don't know.
Okay. Representative Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Larson, for being here. I know that in the area that you live there's an Indian tribe there. Have you consulted them? And what is their opinion of the storage?
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's 2 Indian tribes there. And when I consult a lot with those tribes and made sure that Natrium worked with them on being a, what do we call it, a participant, that's what I'll use, there's another term for it, in that whole nuclear conversation. I have had conversations with tribal leaders, not a formal, either one of the business councils, on their thoughts, and I would share with you that it depends on who you talk to on of the benefits they feel it could have to the tribe, or concerns that they have if it was somehow considered to be on tribal lands.
Follow-up?
Would you be willing to share what some of the benefits or concerns were?
Mr. Chairman, sure. I think they look at jobs. They look at revenue generations to the state or to the tribal government, and their concerns are similar to what Representative Lawley and I talked about earlier, is the safety and those sorts of things.
Thank you.
Committee, I'd like to proceed. I think we have a couple other people here that would like to testify, and so thank you, Representative Larson. Do we have any senators out there that would love to speak on this?
Okay.
Senator Cooper, how are you today?
Good. Ed Cooper, Center District 20. Committee, it's good to see y'all. I want to visit with you a little bit about a trip I took in December to France to tour their nuclear facilities, their nuclear reprocessing facility, their manufacturing facilities, and we spent a lot of time with them. There's 68 million people in France, and roughly 65% of their total generation comes from nuclear. They've been dealing with this process for more than 50 years and have done a great job with it. One of the first things that really came to my attention when I was there is the lack of education that we have regarding it. There's a massive difference, a day and night difference between spent fuel and nuclear waste. I didn't realize that. I'm kind of like everybody here. We all put it in one big pile. Well, it's not. They reprocess their spent fuel in France. They've been doing that since 1975, I believe it is. And they've done it with one small incident. That incident was a pipe that it got exposed, and they handle spent fuel every day. As far as the storage of it, they're their spent fuel comes in from their facilities. It's stored on site at their facilities until they have room in their reprocessing facility to bring that spent fuel in. Then they have a seed stock that's stored in the spent fuels or the reprocessing facility. So they keep several casks there, anywhere from 1 to 20-ish of the cask. The casks they use are much larger than the casks we use in the States, but they're manufactured by exactly the same people. Theirs are transported by rail primarily from all over France and from Germany, and they also bring material in to reprocess from several other European countries and also from Japan. They ship the ones in from Japan by ship. So what really came to my mind is how far behind we are. The rest of the world accepts this and has learned that it is safe. It's common practice, and we can't get past the politics and the fear-mongering of calling this nuclear waste. When they process that fuel, I won't get into a lot of that, but one of those rail cars, one of those casks that come in on a rail car, ends up in 2 casks about 1 meter across and 2 meters high. That's what's left. Everything else is reprocessed and put back into the fuel stream. I think it's phenomenal that we can't get past even storage, let alone reprocessing and developing nuclear in the United States. But back to the storage, the casks are on site there at LOG, are in a secure area, great security. After it's processed, it goes into these smaller casks and it goes into their repository, which is, maybe 3 or 4 times the size of this room. There's 2 buildings. There's 50 years of their waste in those 2 buildings. So it's not a big thing. It's simply not. They store their cask in a vertical chamber, stack them up and fill another one up right beside it, kind of like a well bore, if you will. It's cemented. It's a steel casing with cement around it. It's like we would consider a surface pipe. It's really quite simple, quite safe. They don't have incidents. And again, the big thing to me was the difference between spent fuel and nuclear waste. They reprocess 96% of their spent fuel, as the spent fuel comes in, 96% of that volume is reprocessed. They end up with 1 cask of a glass material after the vitrification process and 1 cask of the stainless steel material that's compressed into one of those casks, and that's it. So we make a really big deal out of a very common practice in the rest of the world. So, I'm not sure what else to visit with you about it, and open for any questions.
Committee, Representative Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator, for being here. Do you think France would be interested in buying this material that we're looking to store here in Wyoming?
Senator Cooper.
Representative Heiner, Chairman Heiner, Representative Campbell, no, because they have far more than they can handle for the rest of the world. We have 90,000 tons of spent nuclear fuel being stored at 100+ different locations around the United States today, because we can't get past the politics of putting it in one place.
Follow up?
Yeah, and follow up, are you aware, what is France's process? Because I'm assuming that you're talking the facility that you visited, this must also be an interim storage facility, is that correct?
Senator Cooper.
Representative Tarver, Representative Tarver, Representative Campbell, their interim storage is short-term is much like ours, only much shorter term. They store on-site until they have room at their processing center for their interim storage there, which they use for a seed stock. And then their repository is on-site at the reprocessing center for the waste. All the other material goes back to the owner of that material, whatever generator still belongs, that fuel still belongs to them. They don't take actual possession of the waste until they put it in their repository, but it is also on the hog site. But what we learned also was that, they've been taking material for Finland, for Germany, for Austria, and those countries are in the process of building their own repositories right now. There's one under construction in Finland. There's one permitted in Canada right now. They're getting ready to go with theirs. So the rest of the world's moving forward with this, while we sit here on our thumbs and watch 2,000 tons of nuclear spent fuel grow around the United States on an annual basis. So again, there's 90,000 tons in storage roughly today in the United States, and that's grown by 2,000 tons a year.
Hold on. Is there anyone else on the committee that would like to ask a question on this to Senator Cooper? I have one question for you, Senator Cooper, and I already asked Representative Larson. Federal government, I assume they're working on a repository, a permanent storage facility. Do you know where we are at the federal level at finding a permanent repository for this? Or are we going to become temporary/permanent? I think that's the biggest fear right now that my constituents are feeling is it's not going to be temporary. Temporary is going to be forever. And I don't know who you have met in this process, but at the federal level, are we currently maybe they should go to France with you and figure this out. But my point is where are we at in this process at the federal level?
Representative Tarver, I've asked that question of a senator that I met with recently. He gave me the name of his representative, and I haven't had a chance to follow that up yet. But I'll make that call again today. I've got that gentleman's number in my bag, and I'll make that call today. And I think that's a real fair question. That's something we should know. What's being done in the United States for a permanent repository? I know there are people working on it. I was told very clearly that, but haven't had the opportunity over the last 2 months to really follow up on that.
Thank you. And committee, we're going to move forward here. Thanks for your testimony. Are there any other senators or representatives? State agencies?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Todd Parfit, Director of the Department of Environmental Quality, and with me is Brandy O'Brien, who is the Land Quality Division Administrator, and prior to that, the manager of the Uranium Recovery Program that we have as an agreement state with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I'll try to be brief on my remarks here. I think Representative Larson did a pretty comprehensive overview of what statutes exist relative to either uranium mining and milling and/or the spent nuclear fuel or high-level radioactive waste. What this bill does is it extracts out of Article 15 the components related to used nuclear fuel, or spent nuclear fuel is the term used by the NRC. But I think it's there was some intent to say, well, it's used nuclear fuel, it's not spent, because there's still viable fuel there. There was some discussion about temporary. That was a concern of mine as well, is how do you define what temporary is? And I would just point out that in Article 15, it is defined as 40 years, which can be extended by action by the legislature. So that's the way we've historically defined temporary. Now, the other concern that I had as we went through the discussion on this was, is this a permit, or is this a notification, or is it just exactly what are we as a state, as the department, what would we be acting upon? And I think that's been clarified somewhat with the amendment provided by Representative Larson. Now, the items, obviously there's going to be the application from the NRC, the license from the NRC, a written acknowledgement that it's temporary in nature. We've talked about that. But the components where I think it kind of falls into the permit category is that if it's not already provided, there are four things. The criteria upon which the proposed installation was chosen, and how it meets the criteria of the NRC and DEQ, the technical feasibility of the proposed storage equipment and technology, environmental, social, and economic impacts of the installation, and conformance with federal guidelines. Those are things that we would need to review to determine whether or not they've satisfied the requirements of the bill. And so I think it's appropriate that there would be a permit associated with that, and we would call it that. I would also just point out that through the NRC process, that's where the public comment would be. The way this is structured, there really wouldn't be any, there is no opportunity in the statute for public comment. Now, if we do rulemaking, we may want to consider having some opportunity for public comment, but that public comment opportunity would be through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and through the NEPA process, because there would have to be a NEPA process associated with this. As far as I wanted to go back to Article 15 and some changes that were made. And when we start talking about, is there a permanent storage facility? Article 15 cannot be enacted unless there is a permanent storage facility. It used to say until Yucca Mountain was approved. Once it became obvious that that wasn't going to happen, the legislature modified Article 15 to just say until a permanent repository is made available. So following that, there was a change to Article 15 as a result of the Natrium facility to allow the storage of the spent nuclear fuel on site, because that's really the only place where it can be today, is that it would be stored on site. So that change was made there, and I bring that up because this bill actually would eliminate that in Article 15, and it moves it over, in my mind, to Article 21, which is the advanced nuclear reactors. So just wanted to point that out. And then there is an exemption from the Industrial Siting Act. That exists in Article 15 currently. And then in Article 21, however, industrial siting is still required for Article 21, which is the advanced nuclear reactors, but only to the extent that it does not duplicate or contradict anything that is required by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And then what you'll find if you look at Article 15, Article 21, and the bill, is that on page 6, line 16 through page 7, line 14, that language is identical in all three. So it just carries over. And what that is the provide a report to DEQ containing the number of jobs created, the state and local taxes generated, all benefits and impacts that will accrue, and then a provision that the operator would submit information to the emergency management departments of local governments and make the information available on a public website. That's in all three. And then, as has been talked about, the used nuclear fuel would remain the property of the generator. As Representative Larson mentioned, that there is the question, what's the incentive? How do you, at the end of the time frame that's defined, whether it's 40 years or some other time frame identified in the NRC license, how do you ensure that that actually gets moved off that temporary site? And the one suggestion and the one amendment I think you have is that there would be an additional fee to the owner of the used nuclear fuel if it wasn't moved within the requisite time frame. With that, we'll take any questions that you have.
Representative Knapp.
Thank you, Vice Chairman, and thank you for being here today. Your department is very, very crucial in protecting Wyoming resources, Wyoming citizens, in our environment and our quality of water, air, and everything else. So going back to the Texas litigation, part of that is losing the ability for the state to be involved in permitting. And it's not just Texas, it's another state as well. But what is your thoughts on that piece of this where the NRC basically has interjected itself into saying, we are the permitter of private companies without state acknowledgement or condoning or signing off, I would say, of it. Just what is your opinion of that based on your experience?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Knapp, it would be my position that, one, the NRC would have to coordinate very closely with the state, and we would be a cooperating agency through the NEPA process, that we would work very closely with the NRC on any siting, and that the governor and/or legislature could object to the siting of a facility within the state if they felt that that was appropriate.
Follow-up?
Yes, Vice Chairman, thank you. So would you recommend that case be allowed to be settled before Wyoming entered into any type of law that would allow NRC to do that?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know enough about that case to really speak to it, but to the extent that there's coordination and cooperation between the federal agency and the state of Wyoming, I would definitely support that.
Follow-up.
One last follow-up. Thank you, Vice Chairman. So in that permitting, if NRC went beyond the 40 years, which we are calling temporary on-site storage, and goes beyond, which is obviously the case since we've been since 1982 and not found a repository. You deal so much with bonding. In your opinion, what kind of bond would have to be in place to cover the expenses of a possible leak in a canister or multiple canisters across Wyoming?
Director.
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Knapp, what we would do is go through an engineering calculation of what it would cost the state if there were such an event that were to occur, and we would want to have the bond to cover all of those costs.
Director, I'd like to piggyback off that just a little bit. So we establish a bond, and how do you establish a bond when the time is unknown?
Mr. Chairman, if I could get a little bit of clarification, with the time of what is unknown?
Well, we don't seem to know how the time frame of temporary is. we don't seem to know the time frame of when we'll have a permanent repository. So this is very concerning because the shelf life on this is pretty long. So how do we establish a bond that could cover this up to, we don't know the time frame?
So, Mr. Chairman, the way I would look at it is that the bond would be for an event. And it would be for the life, as long as that temporary repository were in existence, that bond would be required. And now you may reassess the amount of the bond on a periodic basis, which is what we do currently with most of our facilities. Every year, we update the bond requirements or calculations.
Just a little bit more information. So let's say the owner of the spent fuel goes bankrupt. Then who's liable for the spent fuel at that point?
Mr. Chairman, my guess would, I would look to the NRC. They're the ones that issued the license for the facility.
Pleading the fifth. Representative Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Director, and Ms. O'Brien. What I'm seeing here on this timeline is we can't set a timeline because we're missing a step in our chain of custody. We're missing that final repository. Until we get that information, I don't believe it is possible. I want your opinion. Is it possible to set a realistic timeline without that critical piece of information being available to us?
Director.
So, Mr. Chairman and Representative Campbell, I think it's a good question, and that's where I had raised that particular concern. And just to give you an idea, so temporary could be time limited by the NRC. It would be limited within their license how long that time frame is. Or it can be when it goes to a permanent repository, but to your point, that we're not clear, or it's not clear as to where the federal government is on moving forward with a permanent repository. And even if they start moving forward, we know that that will take numerous years or decades to finalize. But the other would be delivery of the fuel to a facility for reprocessing. And that's got some issues too, but that's where we would want to have some commitment in this process by the owners of the nuclear fuel of what their long-term goals are and how they're going to achieve that, whatever the temporary timeframe is. And then the last thing would be if there is a purchaser of the used nuclear fuel for reprocessing. So there are several steps in there where that can be defined, but you're correct, is right now the best we have is 40 years is temporary.
Chairman Heiner, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Director, we heard during the interim when this bill was first brought in, as well as this morning, that used nuclear fuel can already be brought into the state, and this bill is just to clarify some statute. Without this bill, is that correct, that used nuclear fuel could come into the state and this manufacturing facility that is being contemplated for micro reactors could come into the state and build their facility and store their used nuclear fuel without anything being changed with this statute? Is it possible today to do this?
Director.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Heiner, just give me a minute to think through the various statutes that we have in place. So I would say currently under Article 15, if you have high-level radioactive waste or spent nuclear fuel, unless it's at a facility that, a nuclear power plant, the answer would be no. We don't have the current construct for the storage of used nuclear fuel or high-level radioactive waste other than in the case of a power plant.
Committee. Thank you, Director. Ms. Brand, would you like to speak on this bill?
Mr. Vice Chairman, Mr. Chairman, Committee, there have been a lot of questions about, the long-term plan for spent nuclear fuel. And the Department of Energy has been working on a consent-based siting approach in which they're looking at transportation of spent nuclear fuel. Part of this plan is the interim storage with the idea of having the long-term spent nuclear storage facilities. That being said, they've been at this for a while, and it's an ongoing project for them. I'm not aware of any final sites having been identified, but I do know that in the Department of Energy's plan that this interim storage facility is a portion of that.
Committee, do we have any questions? I'm gonna tackle you with the same question. So the federal government's been working on it for 62 years. Do you know where we're at in this process? Even a guess would be helpful.
Mr. Vice Chairman, Mr. Chairman, so the Department of Energy, back in 2016, I attended their consent-based siting presentation that they had done. And back in 2016, we actually presented at this committee on a similar topic. And where it was at that time was, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was passed in 1982. Congress decided on Yucca Mountain in 1987. And then, they started construction, basically have it built, that was dropped. Since then, the Department of Energy has been sued for not meeting the requirements of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and not taking ownership of that waste as they were committed to. And so because of that, they're looking for solutions. They have been touring the country, speaking at different places, trying to get people to buy into the consent-based siting, trying to identify these, and I've seen them present at many conferences discussing this topic, but I have not seen progress on finding a final repository at this point.
Thank you. This appears to be a huge game of hot potato. Thank you for your testimony. Do we have any other state agencies or governor's office, either or both, or come on and tackle us?
Good morning, Mr. Vice Chair, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Rob Krieger, Executive Director of the Energy Authority. With me today is Sean Schaub, who is our Nuclear Industry Coordinator. We will be very brief. I think you guys have covered this very well this morning. Just wanted to say, just this summer, the Regulatory Reduction Task Force asked us in front of them to talk about this topic as well and look into it. As you all know, we're kind of the first stop for any nuclear companies that are looking to maybe have business in Wyoming or bring their reactor technology here. And as we went down this path and looked into what this would possibly mean for Wyoming, it was very clear to us that if the state were to ever do this, it'd need to start at the local level. And if the locals want to do that. So we, not pushing or saying we should or shouldn't, we've worked with the County Commissioners Association and WAM just to say, use us for information. Here's what this would look like. I know this has been talked about already. And we had the NRC out here this summer as well, just to talk about all of this. So again, I don't want to rehash what's already been discussed this morning. Just want to be a piece of information for you guys if you have any questions, and happy to answer.
Thank you. Questions? Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Schwab?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Sean Schaub with the Energy Authority, like the director said. Like I said, I live in this kind of world looking at and evaluating things related to nuclear. So happy to provide any more context or answer any additional questions if there are any.
Thank you. Committee? Representative Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman, and thanks for being here. This can be posed to either one of you, but the way I'm reading this bill and with the amendments, if we pass this bill, this will go a long way to help Wyoming with its deficit in energy demand, or the challenge with addressing the deficit of energy that we need to continue to grow industry in Wyoming. So I guess just, wouldn't you agree? Can you drill down on that more?
Who would like to tackle that?
I'll try to tackle that, Mr. Vice Chair, Representative Larson. The way I read this bill is, we can currently bring in nuclear reactors. The Natrium project, as mentioned, we're working with a company called BWXT to look at microreactors. So I don't think that this would prohibit that. I think when we just talk about storage, if, again, that's something a community wants to look at, it just provides that framework. It doesn't force us to do it or anything like that.
Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Mr. Schwab, are you kind of following the Texas case? You mentioned that you're generally kind of in this world. Can you provide a little insight specifically, because as I understand it, the case has to do with who actually gets to control these decisions, and kind of talking about this idea of local level consent as the starting point. What are you seeing in that case and how it's developing?
Mr. Schwab.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Tarver. Thanks, Representative Lawley. Yeah, I've been following this case a little bit. It is set to be heard by the Supreme Court here this spring. One thing to kind of keep in mind about this, that proposed facility, along with a similar one in a neighboring state, which will probably be encompassed within that same Supreme Court case, is a private, independent, away from reactor spent fuel storage facility. And so, I'm not an attorney, but part of the initial kind of situation with that is when the proceedings began with the NRC and licensing that, whether or not the state of Texas and other people, companies and things involved in the state, whether or not they had party aggrieved status during that situation, since they brought up their issues following the license being given by the NRC. So that's kind of the first stage. This will certainly tie into, and I want to make this clear, that a private facility versus a federal consolidated interim storage facility, which is what's being addressed by the Department of Energy in their consent-based siting program that's going right now. So it will certainly have implications. The DOE recognizes in their consent-based siting program currently that they will require from Congress approval to site a consolidated interim storage facility because of the fact that, like we've all talked about, it is tied to currently Yucca Mountain being the sole designation for a permanent geologic repository. So, likely what would need to happen is that would be opened back up, and a search for a new geologic repository would be commenced at that time. But currently, that is kind of the issue. So, yeah, back to Texas. I mean, it'll be that'll tell us, a lot based on how the Supreme Court sees that. What is interesting in that case is, the NRC currently has the authority under 10 CFR Part 72 to license what's called an ISFC, an Independent Spent Fuel Storage Installation. So I've had the opportunity to visit some of these where, like Representative Larson mentioned, the operating reactor has since been fully decommissioned, there's no trace of it left on the land. And all that remains is that ISFC, it's hard to say, where just those storage casks are sited, and there's a small operation with security. And so they currently have a process for licensing those types of facilities. And that's all encompassed within the licensing pathway to license an advanced or a nuclear reactor.
Follow-up.
Thank you. That was very helpful. So just to make sure I followed you, on these independents where you have the separate authority of the NRC to go in and independent fuel storage, is there any local consent there in that process, or what you tell me that basically the NRC preempts all of that and there's really no say the local people are given? Is that what I understand?
Mr. O'Brien, or Schwab, excuse me.
Vice Chairman Trevor. I'm not, I know that through the NRC's licensing pathway that I mentioned under Part 72, there's a number of opportunities for, public forum, public comment, things like that. I've got some of those outlined here. So under 7246, public hearing, 7216, when they file the application for a specific license, there's opportunities for public engagement there, along with a couple others. But what I'll say is that, again, I'm not quite sure how that process went at that time, since it was a private installation. The approach that the Department of Energy is taking on their consent-based approach comes from a Blue Ribbon Commission report that was published in 2012, I believe, that outlined the need for this consent-based process. I mean, we go back, this has obviously had a very complicated history. And this is their effort to address that and understand that, like, they really need to have engagement with the local community during this process. And this is not a short process. The process that they have lined out for the siting of a consolidated interim storage facility is, so the process that they're in now is sort of building capacity within these communities that have some interest, sharing information, setting up visits to places like, our Freds and INL who are storing various forms of radioactive waste and used fuel. And so that's kind of where they're at now. The next stage this coming fall will be when interested communities can submit an expression of interest to say, hey, we're interested in having a more direct talk about what this looks like. It doesn't commit the state or the community to doing anything, but it's where you can start gathering more information and telling them, like, what your community is concerned about, what things need to be addressed in their process as you then move towards the subsequent phases in that program, where you start to get into negotiating and what the benefits to the community will be. The state will have, or the community will have, say into what vendor you want to use for the casks, what type of cask storage you want to use, whether it's vaults or these various NRC licensed storage mechanisms. So again, the federal approach right now, kind of talking to that, the process they're in right now is really engaging deeply with those communities and understanding, like, what the concerns are, and getting, no shortage of public involvement through that process.
More, Mr. Chair.
We gotta keep.
Well, it goes to the reason the public is confused.
Okay, make it short and sweet, please.
Well, again, you alluded to that, even as recently as 1987, against a lot of confusion in this process. Would you agree that, it's confusing as we sit here and try to walk through it. So when we talk about concerns of the public, this is an important issue to Wyoming for a number of reasons. But it is a difficult task to communicate for the public to understand. That creates that unknown. What little they might know really affects how they view this process. So I just kind of want to make that point, because it's not the public's fault that they're confused and concerned, and we do need to address that. So that's my point, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Was that a question? Yeah, it was, I guess.
Vice Chairman Trevor, I'll certainly agree. Yes, no, there's the concerns going back to, when this all sort of started during the Manhattan Project, and the complications that developed over the years from sort of that side of the technology versus the energy production side. There's a lot of work to be done in educating the public, all the stakeholders as to what the concerns are and how they're addressed. So yeah, absolutely agree.
Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. Any other state agencies and/or governor's office? Do we have any citizens that are in the room? Please come forward. State your name, sir, and begin.
Mr. Chairman, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. I spent 30 years in the Navy nuclear submarine world across 6 submarines, living within tens of feet of operating nuclear reactors. Served as a chief engineer, later commanding officer of a nuclear submarine, then commanding officer of a large submarine tender and intermediate level maintenance facility. Got a couple thoughts for you. I've been taking notes as this went on. I did a quick lookup of the Texas case, and the essence of it was President Obama terminated work on the Yucca Mountain thing and put up a blue ribbon task group, the output of which was they should go to a consent-based siting methodology. The appeals court decision said under current law, there was no authority for an intermediate level custody of spent fuel. It either had to be at the plant or with the federal government. So that's the appeals court level of that. With regard to calling it spent fuel instead of waste, I think that's important. The way you load a reactor with fuel is you put in enough fuel, uranium, to get a critical mass. That way you can start the process. Then you put in more fuel above that for burning through the life of the core. Thus, the essence of the day you shut down that reactor, there is still burnable uranium in that spent fuel that could be recovered, which is what France is doing. We made a decision in this nation in the 70s not to recover that uranium, but it could be recovered. And so at some point, there's another possible industry for the state with spent fuel. With regard to the reactor spent fuel heat production, even at 10 years, a ton of fuel is still producing about 1 kilowatt. So these dry cask and other methodologies still need a heat removal capability. With regard to environmental issues, it's useful to go back and look at some things. France discovered in the mid-50s, they were mining uranium in Gabon in Africa, and they discovered there had been a natural reactor about 2 billion years ago that had operated there for probably 10 to 100 million years. And they discovered this from the skewed elements in the fuel they mined. What's important for the environmental thing is they saw no significant environmental effects from leaching or other things from that. Well, does that mean you can't take care of this stuff? No, you got to package it, you got to put it in whatever methodology, dry cast, you got to do it right, and so on and so forth. Important to note that the natrium reactor they're going to put in Kemmerer is a fast reactor, and thus that style of reactor produces less radioactive daughter products than the thermal reactors that we're using typically today, and is typical on Navy ships. Navy stores its fuel, spent fuel, in Idaho out at the facility out there. The Navy is a separate entity from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Wyoming has a lot of future here with this. If you look at the industry, mining, processing, and burning of the fuels right here in Wyoming. And like I said, potentially recovery of that. Usually these plants operate on about an 18-month cycle where they operate, they take them up to 100% power, leave them there for 18 months, burn out the fuel, shut down and refuel. They produce base load. You have another bill on the docket somewhere, one of the committees with regard to base load generation. Coal plants are going to time out. Steam plants just get to a point where you have to replace them. My thought for you is those steam plants could be replaced by a nuclear plant. One thing to keep in mind now that's come up that this coal plant in Kemmerer might not be shut down is pay attention to how much cooling water is available. 95% of the water used in a nuclear plant is cooling water for the steam cycle. Has nothing to do with whether it's nuclear or coal or whatever. Well, you got to have enough of it to flow through the main condensers. So keep your eye on that one. And I'd like to plant a seed with you. As I walked around and talked to people in Kemmerer and other places last summer, there's a real concern for the infrastructure of the town and the surrounding area. And so I think you're going to have to talk to that at some point. Subject to your questions, thank you.
Committee. Thank you for your testimony. Ms. McCann?
Good morning, committee. I'm Nancy McCann. I'm with the Powder River Resources Council, Powder River Basin Resource Council. And I'm here today to provide testimony on behalf of our 1,500 members who consist of landowners, business owners, folks that are your neighbors. And so we do at Powder River have a long-standing policy that each state should take care of its own waste, and that the radioactive waste should be stored at the site of origin to eliminate the hazards of moving the waste. I do have some other points in here, but I want to actually skip those and jump to something that a few of the folks that have testified here today, that there was an action filed on behalf of Texas and New Mexico. Well, that has been expanded to include additional conservative states, and the attorney generals of not only Texas and New Mexico, but Idaho, Utah, Arkansas, South Carolina, Iowa, South Dakota, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and New Mexico, and Michigan have also filed amicus briefs, which is Friends of the Court, in support of the Texas case against the permitting of private nuclear waste storage in their state. So, and that was filed on the 24th of January, and it's going to be heard March 5th on oral arguments. I do want to address a few more things, and that a private storage facility may not have the capacity to deal with an incident. And I don't know what that incident might be, but it might be a terrorist attack. It might be some mistake that was made, some leakage. But if there was an incident, is a private storage facility or owner capable of handling that? And that directly ties to, this bill does not have a fiscal note. And there may be fiscal impact that the state might have to bear, so that it's not just the DEQ. If there was a cleanup involved of any type of incident, there may be a Homeland Security involved, there may be emergency management folks, possibly even the military. We don't know. But we need to plan ahead, be watchful of the cost of that cleanup, because even though it's a private facility, the state may have to bear that burden. So we need to be prepared for that process. And in addition to that, there may be it's not just a short-term cleanup that might happen. There may be a long process in a cleanup, and because we don't know about any kind of waste or nuclear fuel that would go into the environment after that cleanup, and where the residue, this hasn't been talked about, if there is a cleanup and there's residue and materials that need to be dealt with after that cleanup, where is it going to go? Where is it going to be buried? We don't know that. And we don't know the life of the materials itself. So yeah, some of the materials that I've looked at the NRC site, it could have a half-life of 35 to 75 years, could even be 1,000 years. We don't know that. And so I think it's critical to look at the type of materials that's being stored. Now, I'm going to mention something here, and I'm going to be talking about Wyoming wind. We use it for power, and we always are complaining about that wind. Boy, that wind was going. But the fact is, the wind cannot be stopped, reversed, harvested to alleviate any problems if there was a incident or a radioactive spill. And so in other words, that incident would not be just limited to the on-site location. It could spread across Wyoming in ways that we don't know, because who can predict where the wind is going to go? Because it changes directions many times. And then I don't even want to touch on this, but I'm going to say the word water. If there is any type of incident, what would this do to our water supplies? That is very concerning, and I think communities need to have the opportunity to weigh in. I did hear earlier about the temporary storage. I did confirm online from the NRC site that temporary storage doesn't mean 6 months, 6 minutes. It really is 40 years or longer. And that's right directly from their site. And so having said that, when I think of temporary storage, we really are looking more of something that is mixed with a permanent storage. And so we need to look at what the color of that really means.
Ms. McCann, are we close?
Yeah,
We've got many
yeah,
more people.
Yes, and so I'm almost there. The other thing is on the ownership of the nuclear waste and the title, and that was brought up earlier, so I'll just barely touch on that, is that once it does change ownership into the federal government, that we should be concerned and probably need to address that if they own it and they have lots of federal lands in Wyoming, would they have that opportunity to take advantage of their ownership of federal lands and place a federal facility on Wyoming, on federal lands in Wyoming? And so we ask that the committee vote no on this bill. And we do believe that there's a lot more education that needs to occur for Wyoming.
Ms. McCann, thank you so much for your testimony. Mr. North.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. I just wanted to express my concern. You know, we've been looking at an energy crisis for a long time and the changes that are coming. And I do believe that nuclear is going to be a huge portion of what we need to go to in the future. We've already got one plant that's being developed right now in the state. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to expand. And a lot of the things that I'm looking at is the opportunity that we have that with this company potentially coming to Natrona County is that they're small enough units that they could actually help our individual municipalities and stuff like that. So it's a huge benefit, not just to Natrona County, but all the way across the state and in a lot of our communities, because everybody in here knows what our weather looks like in the wintertime. And we know that wind is not always reliable. Solar is not always reliable. Nuclear has 24 hours a day power source that's basically not affected by any of that. And so with the controls that we have and that are coming out of the NRC, I think that that's something that's positive. And I think this is something that we need to look forward to. And I'm speaking for myself. I know that the WCCA did come out in support of this, but I'm speaking from talking to our different communities up in the Casper area. And, you know, the biggest concern that a lot of them had was not necessarily if we're going to have to worry about anything happening, but what it was going to do to property values. We have a lot of nuclear reactors around this country, and if you look at what the property values are around those, they really haven't changed. It's just a matter of education and what you're doing. And a lot of the stuff that they're looking at is going to be coming and going, other than when they do end up having the spent materials at the end. So with that, I'll be open to any questions.
Committee? Mr. Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. North, there's been a lot of comments today about education. Evidently, it's not getting done because I've got hundreds of emails and not one is in support of the project, this idea. Any comments?
I do believe that that's, I go back and I'm, most of you remember 3 Mile Island and how bad, that was perception of that was. And the amount of radiation that was lost in that was less than what you would get in 1 day's sunlight. Education, people think of nuclear and they think of Hiroshima. They don't think of what we actually have. They don't think of how safe it is and how far we've come. And that is something that we definitely need to work on as far as that education level across the board. I think we've failed as a country as far as getting that information out and looking at what options we have and just how safe it really is. You're talking about downwind and stuff like that. Palo Verde Nuclear Power Plant is just to the west side of Phoenix, one of the biggest metropolitan areas in the country. And that's been there for 40 years, 45 years. We haven't heard anything on that. So I do believe that we've come a long way. I believe that there's a lot of people that had other agendas as far as what they wanted to push. And I think nuclear power got pushed in the back seat because of that.
Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since you brought up the Casper project specifically, I was wondering if it's your understanding that this bill would need to pass for that project to proceed?
No.
Mr. North.
Oh, sorry. No, I do not believe. I believe that the authority is within a Nuclear Regulatory Commission right now. But I do believe that it would support, it shows the state support for the activities. And that's the biggest reason why I decided to go ahead. I wasn't planning on testifying today, but I decided to.
Thank you.
Representative Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here. Going back to the original point of this, I agree that nuclear is a wonderful option, but back to how to store the fuel. Is Natrona County prepared for long-term storage of this facility? If this facility was to come, is Natrona County prepared to store that fuel, the spent fuel, whatever we're going to define it as, on site? Is there my biggest concern is the long-term storage of this, because I do not see a long-term repository. So is Natrona County prepared to store that used?
Mr. North.
Thank you. I believe that right now it's classified as temporary under the NRC. And so I believe that a lot of those statutes, regulations are going to have to come out of the federal government. Is changing that and what they're going to do. I think that the facility, what I do know about the operation of that and who's behind that they will do everything they can to be safe. I mean, 20 years ago, who would have thought that we would have a private sector putting rockets into space? Now that's where we're going. So technology has changed. The private sector, if they have the regulations and the requirements to oversee this, I think this is something that we can look at, and I think that can be taken care of and the safety factors be resolved.
Mr. North, thank you for your testimony. We're going to have to keep moving here. Ms. Kessler?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman and committee members. I am here representing myself. Thanks for this opportunity. My name is Steph Kessler. I have a lot of experience in high-level radioactive waste, but I'm going to skip the resume and get right to the point.
Thank you.
I'd like to address 3 key topics about the bill before you: Wyoming's regulatory context, Texas's experience with federal overreach, and the false promise of economic benefit. First of all, it's been very confusing, I understand, with the committee, but I want to make clear that this bill does not address Wyoming's waste needs. This is not about managing waste from our nuclear reactors or businesses in state. We already have the laws on the books to allow nuclear reactors to be built here and to store their waste here. Like the Natrium plant, these laws are in place now. Amendments took place in 2013 and 2022, and we can build more reactors here already. This law is not needed to continue with our own businesses. If there is a concern about waste storage for Wyoming-based nuclear reactor manufacturers, HB 16 is not really addressing that need either. But SF 186 introduced this session does. It's a focused and targeted bill for just Wyoming's situation, and I support that approach. In contrast, HB 16 is about a massive scale out-of-state waste, potentially all of the commercial nuclear waste in the United States. The estimated amount is 90,000 metric tons. It's staggering. I really want to make clear that no facility like this has ever existed in the United States, ever, taking this quantity of waste from around the country. It's never been assembled in one location. The NRC has never handled the storage or transportation of this much high-level radioactive waste to a single site. But that is what HB 16 fast tracks and enables. To put this in perspective, Wyoming's Natrium reactor might produce only 0.09 metric tons of spent fuel over its entire lifetime. HB 16, on the other hand, invites this 90,000 metric tons into Wyoming 1 million times more than the one reactor. Secondly, Texas's experience proves that the federal government cannot be trusted with this. And even though I support them in some other things, I do not support them here. We don't have to speculate about how this will play out because Texas has already gone through it. A private company proposed the same kind of facility that HB 16 would enable and fast track. Texas Governor Greg Abbott opposed it. He cited economic, environmental, and security risks. He called the proposal risky and wholly unauthorized. He said the facility was poorly sited. He called it put at a random location, right in the heart of the Permian Basin, putting their oil and gas industry at risk. The legislature in Texas banned the facility. They passed a law against it. And yet the NRC ignored that and approved the license anyway, overriding the will of Texas's elected officials and residents. And Mr. Vice Chairman and committee, I've heard a lot of talk about people just need to get educated enough. I'm sorry, but I think Texas is a pretty well-educated state, and their legislature and their governor, and there's more to it than just getting educated. Texas sued and won in federal court. The ruling found that the NRC violated federal law by approving the site, but it's been appealed to the Supreme Court, as you've heard, and Texas has to continue to fight to keep this waste out. So what does this experience tell us here in Wyoming? State opposition and input doesn't matter to the NRC. The federal government, the NRC, does not necessarily properly cite or address safety and environmental concerns, and they ignore those expressed local concerns. And legal battles are inevitable. Wyoming could be next. And this just isn't Texas. New Mexico had the same situation. They passed laws against it. The governor opposed it. And NRC still issued the license there. So we could find ourselves in the same losing battle with federal regulators. And then finally, I really want to make out a point that there's no money in this for Wyoming. Even if the Supreme Court allowed Texas and New Mexico sites to go forward, there wouldn't be a market for any Wyoming facility. those sites are decades ahead of us if we were to start building or looking at one. They have their licenses already. And together, they are licensed to hold over 200,000 metric tons of commercial nuclear waste, more than double the total waste in the US right now. So if those two sites are deemed legal, there's no need for any third facility in Wyoming. And I also want to clarify that the Nuclear Waste Fund was mentioned as maybe providing money for this. That only applies to a federally operated facility. That money is not allowable for a private facility.
Ms. Kessler, are we
Yes,
getting?
I'm just about done. So the idea that Wyoming could make money does not hold up, and there's only risk, liability, and legal fights. So I ask you to defeat this bill and instead put your attention with SF 186, which could probably address another need for just Wyoming's own storage needs. And I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Ms. Kessler, thank you very much for your testimony. We're about out of time, folks. So has anyone traveled to specifically talk about this? Can we please, do you have something short and sweet?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Bill Novotny, Johnson County Commissioner, here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. I just need to correct previous testimony. The Wyoming County Commissioners Association is not in support of this bill. You will notice that it does not appear on the bill sheet that we presented to you. For that to happen, 70% of Wyoming's commissioners have to be either in support or in opposition of that. So I just want to correct the record that we are not in support of this bill.
Mr. Novotny, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for that. Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves and give us your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Matt Wilson, representing Radiant, a micro-nuclear reactor developer. Alongside me is my colleague, Makai Cartman, who's leading our factory siting initiatives. So to start, I just wanted to help folks understand when I say micro-reactor developer, what does that mean? Many of the operating reactors around the US are around 1 gigawatt or 1,000 megawatts of power generation. The Natrium reactor is going to be somewhere in the realm of 300 to 500 megawatts. If you've heard of the BWXT Banner reactor, that may be sited at in the Trona Mine region, that's around 50 megawatts. Radiant is developing a 1 megawatt microreactor, so 1/1000th the size of the operating reactors you see around the US. A single container, and our factory will be for manufacturing of units that will be deployed maybe partially in Wyoming if we do site in Wyoming, but around the US and potentially international markets as well. Representative Lloyd called out that we were in Casper a couple weeks ago, had a Q&A session to help folks understand our operation and what we would be bringing to an area like Natrona County. That meeting was preceded by multiple due diligence trips over the course of 2024 to qualify Wyoming and a specific site in Natrona County for our operations. And so since this bill, at least the amended portion for advanced nuclear reactors, is focused on spent fuel, I will call, my understanding is the current statute focuses on operating reactors in the state of Wyoming. We will be building the Wyoming-built reactors, but they will be deployed and operated outside of the state. Now, when we turn on a reactor, build a reactor, we have to have the capability to manage the entire life cycle of that reactor, which does include pulling out the fuel and putting it into a dry cask in a spent fuel repository, or an ISPC, as you heard Sean Shaw call it. So to do that, we do think there needs to be some type of adjustment to the current statute, which this bill would cover. To help you understand what the spent fuel would look like for Radiant, again, mega reactors around the US, 1,000 megawatts. And so let's just say for an understanding, when they're putting their units into dry cask storage, for simplicity, there are hundreds of megawatts of their fuel rods inside of one of those dry casks. Radiant's hopeful that we can put multiple reactor cores inside of one dry cask. And even in that scenario, we are talking about the equivalent of a handful of megawatts of spent fuel. So it is significantly less spent fuel that's actually being stored in dry casks. And then on top of that, at our scale, we're using what's called an advanced fuel. We're using TRISO fuel, which is a new type of fuel that's not used in the operating reactors today. And so based off of some recent messaging from the NRC. They're expecting advanced reactor developers to be as safe or safer than the current spent fuel installations that are out there today. The last thing that I'll call out when it comes to community engagement, education, at least specifically for Radiant's use case, one of the reasons we haven't announced a final site is we do see the importance of getting out in the community that we want to be in and help folks understand what they're signing up for. Not just the back end, what does the spent fuel look like? How are we going to manage it? Why is it safe? Why is it even safer in Radiant's use case? But then also, what do the upfront jobs look like? What is the manufacturing process? What are the capital dollars to bring this factory to life? And what is Radiant trying to do as we see a growing nuclear industry in the state of Wyoming? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, committee. Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I think I heard you say that you felt there might need to be some statutory adjustment. Do you feel that the other bill mentioned, Senate file, I don't remember the exact number, but Senator Cooper's bill will address those?
Mr. Vice Chairman, Representative, yes, I think we have another option. This bill does cover us as well, which is why we felt the need or interest to be here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Do you have anything for us?
I'll keep this brief, but just wanted to again mention that we are only looking at storing the fuel from our reactors that we own and operate. And so that's all we'd be looking to store. And as Matt mentioned, we've been to Casper several times and are looking to engage with the community and make sure that we're keeping their thoughts and concerns in mind and making sure that we're addressing those concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Mark, do we have someone online that's registered and raring and tearing?
Maria Catherman.
Can you bring her on in, please? And Ms. Catherman, or is it, yes, Catherman, we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to give you about 2 minutes, ma'am, to give us your thoughts on this.
She's in where she needs to be, but she's not.
Ms. Catherman, can you hear us?
No.
Okay, well, we'll move back right in front of us.
Mayor, I think I may have solved the problem from my end.
Okay, please give us your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Maria Catherman. I live out of Douglas. And I was watching this whole proceeding, and especially Ms. Kessler's testimony struck home to me. So I hope that you can re-listen to that when you're making your decisions here. It looks like this bill is not quite ready, and I would urge you to not pass it here and now. This is a really important issue, and it needs more time than you have taken this morning and more background from various voices. So I hope that you will see that we're not ready to pass this because it makes extreme changes that have not been considered. So I hope that we can look at the Senate bill, and those that are interested in this issue can attend that meeting as well. So I would urge you to vote no on this, as I think most of your constituents are asking you to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Catherman. Sir, could you give us your testimony?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is John Burrows. I'm here representing the Wyoming Outdoor Council. We're Wyoming's oldest independent conservation organization. We were founded in 1967, and our mission is to protect Wyoming's environment and quality of life for future generations. I had a testimony prepared, and I think every single one of the points that I wanted to bring up has been addressed. We stand in opposition to this bill. There's actually one point, though, that I would like to follow up on, and that is similar to you, Representative Schmidt. We have received many phone calls about this issue over the last few months since this bill passed out of committee. And I can confidently say that we know this issue is of deep concern and interest to many in the state. One of our main concerns, in addition to many of the ones you've heard today, is actually with how suddenly this topic has been brought up at the end of interim, and with how little this bill has been discussed with the public. We think there is a significant amount of public interest in the topic here. And on that point alone, would encourage you all not to rush this. Take the time needed to broaden the conversation, get the education that we've been talking about in this committee meeting, and really ground truth how Wyomingites feel about this very important issue. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Burrows. And with that, I'm going to close public testimony. Committee, what's your pleasure? Mr. Campbell's motion, we table it. Do I have to have a second for that? And I'll need a second for that. And Representative Knapp is going to second that. Is that debatable? That's non-debatable, so I guess all in favor of tabling it, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? That motion carries.
Mr. Chairman, I do have just a comment, not with the debate, but I think that it's important that we do get the input from the public. This was, it could very well be an interim topic. For that reason, I think it's a very serious bill. It's a very serious decision, policy-wise for the state of Wyoming. And so with that, I had the second.
I would agree with that. I think it definitely could use an interim and get way more public testimony on this. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And with that, we'll close the meeting.